This is the Heartland Daily Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Heartland Institute's Daily Podcast. I'm Sterling Burnett, Heartland Senior Fellow and Managing Editor of Environment and Climate News. I'm pleased to have as a guest today Robert J. Smith, RJ to his friends, of which I'm honored to count myself as one. He has many affiliations. I came to know him through his work at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's more than 28 years ago now. It's hard to believe. Where RJ serves as a distinguished fellow for energy and the environment, and he also serves as a senior fellow for environmental policy at the National Center for Public Policy Research. RJ is among the godfathers of free market environmental movement, in fact, having coined the term free market environmentalism in his book, Earth's Resources, Private Ownership versus Public Waste. As a consultant to the Department of Interior and the President's Council on Environmental Quality, RJ worked on the first report of the President's Council on Environmental Quality under Reagan, stressing how markets can and do protect species and promote wildlife recovery, basically private conservation efforts. In fact, protecting wildlife is what got RJ working on environmental issues to begin with. Recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service proposed some changes and reforms purportedly to streamline, make consistent, and improve the Endangered Species Act. That's what RJ's here to discuss today. RJ, thanks for being with us.
It's good to be on with you, Sterling. These are great ideas and great issues to work with, and hopefully one of these days we'll get some environmental policy that will make sense and work for people as well as working for wildlife.
Yeah, we'll get some real reform. I tell you, it's hard to believe it's been 28 years I've known you, RJ.
That's a long time. Yeah, I guess that goes back to goes back a long time.
Yeah, 1990 when I was at CEI. So, RJ, before we jump into the discussion of the Fish and Wildlife Service's proposals, their ESA reforms, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you, please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you came to work on endangered species issues.
Well, I grew up on the West Coast, and it's a beautiful place to live and a great climate. You can be outside, all year round. And I quickly became interested in natural history, nature issues, and particularly in birds. From a very young age, I became a bird watcher. I had a grandmother. I lived in San Francisco, a grandmother in Portland, Oregon, and she was a renowned naturalist up there, and famous for fossils she collected and various hybrid flowers and plants she would grow and so on. And she also had an interest in birds, collected birds' nests and whatever. And she introduced me in the summers when I was a little kid. I'd go up there. And she'd introduce me to some professional ornithologists she knew, and they helped develop my interest in nature. And so from an early age, I cared about wildlife, cared about birds, and if you care about birds, you care about the habitat they're in and who's protecting them and where they're being protected and what kind of habitat they're in. And after I finished up undergraduate work in geology out in California, I came east to do graduate work in economics, and I lived in the New York City and northern New Jersey area. And when I was in New Jersey, I got involved with a local county nature club, the Monmouth County Nature Club, became president of that. I was president of it for a number of years. And while I was there, it became an affiliated chapter of the National Audubon Society, a county chapter. And one of my friends, who was also on our nature club organization on the board, one of the officers was also the National Conservation Club for the Sierra Club, the entire Sierra Club in the U.S. And we were great birding buddies, and travel all around the country looking for birds in different parts of the country. And that was in the late '60s into the early '70s. And that was the time of sort of the birth of the environmental movement, of the radical green movement, replacing the old conservation movement. And suddenly you began hearing from people that capitalism and free enterprise and private property were antithetical to environmental preservation. In fact, capitalism supposedly caused environmental destruction and devastation. And I started thinking about that. I mean, most people weren't taking that very seriously. I mean, when you started seeing cars go around with bumper stickers saying "Save the Whales," many conservatives or free market people would just joke about it and put up their bumper stickers saying "Nuke the whales" or "Nuke the gay whales" or something like that, which certainly didn't contribute to any way of resolving and dealing with those issues, and in fact convinced lots of folks that conservatives and the right in general simply did not care about the environment and environmental issues. And this was of considerable concern, particularly as environmentalism began to grow, not only as a mass movement about young kids who were skeptical of existing order to begin with, but as politicians began to make it an issue, and both in addition to Democrats who quickly jumped on it, all kinds of Republicans were jumping on it and trying to outdo each other, all during the very late 60s and particularly the 70s, following Earth Day 1. And so I got to think, well, we're in deep trouble if people think, well, capitalism is neat because, it makes all kinds of great products and it gives us, fantastic television sets and new cars and everything keeps coming along and everybody gets better off. But if they believe that as a byproduct of that, it destroys the very planet that we live on, we're in deep trouble. And about that time, I was asked by the National Libertarian Party. They said, we're having all kinds of problems on college campuses. Kids love the free market, and they said, well, we don't need the government to tell us, what car to buy or what book to read or what television set to. We can figure all this out, or we can read Consumer Reports or something like that. But people don't see how it's possible that we could how would we save the redwoods? How would we save the whales? How would we save endangered species? And can you address those issues? And so I came down to Washington then and spent about half a year down here working on what became this book that you mentioned, Earth's Resources. And what I developed is what I called free market environmentalism, and which is what the term eventually became to be used by other groups that were individuals and at various centers and universities who were beginning to think along the same line. How do we deal with all the raft of environmental regulation that are coming down, that are regulating every single aspect of human life? And so I came up with the idea, well, how would we extend, rather than turning to government, big government, which is simply going to have command and control over everything and take a tyrannical approach to everything, regulate what everybody does, tell them what they can do and what they can't do. How do we use the institutions of a free society to protect the environment, like we use the institutions of a free society to make all the other fantastic improvements that have occurred over the last 200 years? And how would we use property rights? How would we use markets? And how we would use prices? And so that's where I began to develop this whole concept of looking at basically that it was an issue of property rights. I mean, people who own things have very strong incentives to take care of them. People who own things are able to sue for trespass or harm from people who harm them, who invade their land, who pollute their land, who kill their trees or pollute their water or whatever. But there has to be property rights there to begin with. And people who own things also have very different incentives to manage things and to care for them than somebody who's just a government bureaucrat. A government bureaucrat.
If I could intervene for just a second, so you come along at a time in the 70s when government was stepping in to so-called protect the environment, and a generation of people were raised believing that the environment wasn't being protected, but in fact, they don't realize, I think, and I haven't seen your book. It's
long out of print.
Yeah, it's long out of print. But as you and I both know, it was the government that got involved in the first place to undermine property rights protecting the environment back in the early part of the 20th century when they decided it was time to promote business and we couldn't let things like property rights get in the way of all sorts of municipal functions and big business efforts. They destroyed the use of property rights to protect the environment that had been working for over 100 years, and that's when pollution really got serious.
Right. Yeah. Now I did an article I think in 1981 for the Heritage Foundation for their journal called Policy Review, called Privatize the Environment, in which I went back and looked at the development of air and water pollution in the United States. And we had started down the line of protecting property rights to air and water on your land, and sort of following in the tradition of the common law of Britain. And we began to get a lot of major conflicts when a large, say, steel factory or smelting operation or coking operation or whatever would put vast amounts of pollutants into the air, and then they would kill off an orchard, downwind, or they would make the air essentially unbreathable downwind and so on. And when the first court cases were brought, folks stepped in to argue against the use of protecting property rights. And the same thing happened in a little earlier in the with water pollution when the first mill dams and so on went in on the rivers along the East Coast, along the fall line. And they would flood. They put in the dam or flood upstream landowners, and also they might pour the waste into the water downstream, and it would pollute water downstream. And once again, rather than protecting property rights and forcing industry to find more non-polluting ways, or forcing them to locate elsewhere where they weren't causing harm to people, instead of being upwind of a major pollution center, that would require them to go downwind or find a new technology that wasn't as polluting. This essentially gave them carte blanche to go ahead and pollute, because the court.
Governments intervene. Well, but my reading history is the courts actually were defending property rights. It was when legislatures got involved to override common law protections with positive law, saying no, we can't let these rights get in the way of so-called progress. So, but I'm sorry, RJ.
Major decisions too that were wrong, and they began to rule that if you were big enough and created enough jobs, well, then the common good, it was sort of a utilitarian argument that the common good overweighed individual property rights. And so it wasn't really so much a failure of the market failure, as most people said, that led to pollution. But as you said, it was legislative changes allowing pollution to take place, and then courts deciding that for utilitarian reasons that we could not allow individual rights of individual property owners to stand in the way of the good of everybody. There were a lot of decisions like that. There were decisions on air pollution and decisions on water pollution. There was a famous case in the Chesapeake.
RJ, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. We're getting a little far afield.
Okay.
We've gone through over 15 minutes of history of the government intervention. We really needed for our listeners.
Well, the Endangered Species Act was one of these things
right.
that immediately came up, and that was one of the because that had passed all during this wave of hysteria when everybody was jumping on board environmental legislation, where everybody was trying to be greener than the other person, whether it was Republicans or Democrats, and it was on December 28th. 1973, when Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act into law, and everyone was green in those days. And the ESA had passed the Senate earlier that summer by a vote of 92 to nothing, and the ESA had passed the House by a vote of 390 to 12. And then Nixon signed it into law. And we have now had problems with that for the last 45 years.
Yeah. Well, let's get to that. Before the ink was even dry on the proposed changes the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service were proposing, certainly before any of these analysts had time to read and fully analyze the impact, environmentalists were up in arms. I saw press releases within minutes claiming that changes would gut the act. By contrast, my reading of it is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they're fairly technical changes. Some of them are important. To me, I don't think they nearly go far enough, sort of tinkering around the edges, if you will. But nothing that would fundamentally alter the protections afforded to endangered species. Am I reading this wrong? Is this tinkering around the edges, or are environmentalists right? This amounts to fundamental reform. What are your thoughts on the reactions and their analysis?
Well, this doesn't amount to anything in the way of fundamental reform. It is simply some internal regulatory changes. Some of them are very important, but basically it doesn't make the major changes, any major changes in the Endangered Species Act. I mean, this has been the policy of the Green Movement from day one. This is why they've been so successful, is they always cry wolf. If you attempt to even move a comma in a sentence within the Endangered Species Act, they'll cry that the Endangered Species Act is being gutted, that it's going to be destroyed, that the bald eagle is going to go extinct again, the gray whales will disappear, whatever. I mean, these were all the headlines that came out. I mean, the New York Times lead piece on the proposed regulatory changes, and these changes haven't taken place yet. They're simply proposed. Were that the law that saved the bald eagle could be vastly reworked. And the next day, PBS, their On Point program, was headed up, "Are you with the president or the bald eagle?" I mean, this is the kind of hyperbole and so on that the Greens have always used. And they always claim that even the slightest change is going to destroy the act, when the act is there essentially as powerful as it's ever been. I mean, it's the single most powerful law that's ever been passed. When it was challenged shortly after it was originally passed on the Tellico Dam issue, where they were building the TVA was finishing, almost completed a dam called the Tellico Dam in Tennessee on the Little Tennessee River. They discovered a snail darter, unknown snail darter, in the shallow riffle water behind the dam. The dam was $100 million had been spent. It was within a few months of being completed, and so they went to the Greens. Sued to go to court to stop it, and the Supreme Court ruled that the dam had to be stopped because it said they read the bill as saying the clear intent of Congress was to protect every listed species, whatever the cost, period. No other considerations. And they said the cost, the value of an endangered species, of a listed species, was incalculable So that meant that you couldn't even use cost-benefit analysis. If it was put on the list, that stopped things, and that's the way that there were four young people here in Washington, environmental activists and different federal agencies and so on, who actually drafted that 1973 law. And they were asked a number of times by Congress, well, what are we doing? This won't really change the rules of the game, would it, or whatever? And they said they were interviewed in a book called Noah's Choice, The Future of Endangered Species by Mann and Plummer, which I recommend people get. They were quoted as saying, Congress had no idea what they had passed, but we knew because we wrote it. And previous attempts to protect...
Let's be honest. That's become, I don't know if that was rare or common at the time, but it's become ever more common. I mean, it's not in my field, but if you talk about Obamacare, Nancy Pelosi literally said, we have to pass it so we'll know what's in it. That's how they act. They've got to pass laws before they decide to read the things.
Well, yeah, this is one of the first things. And then they were stunned when they found out this law that they had passed. The Senate had passed 92 to nothing, and then the senators and congressmen from Tennessee said, whoa, what do you mean you're going to stop the Tellico Dam because of this little endangered 3-inch long fish? And when it went to the Supreme Court, they said, well, that's what you guys voted. That's what you guys passed.
And then of course they found the fish in other streams. So, but let's move on to discuss sort of your analysis is the proposed changes are not a wholesale rewriting or gutting of the Endangered Species Act.
No, I don't think they change any of the major aspects of the Act or in the ways that the Act is really a disaster. Right. In that it actually penalizes landowners from doing good. It makes landowners live in fear of wildlife on their lands, and it takes private property without compensation. What this really does is sort of redress and correct various usurpations that the agency, the Department of Interior, has self-conducted over the years as it stretched various concepts. For instance, one of the things was the difference between an endangered species and a threatened species. A threatened species is a species which might become endangered sometime in the future. And they were supposed to be treated very differently, because if something's endangered, then that requires much more careful and much more strict rules as to what is done or what you're going to do to protect it if it's threatened, not. But over the years, what the service had done, it has simply stretched that and essentially applied the same regulatory controls on both federal land and on private lands to threatened species as they did to endangered species. And all this does is really return that to the way it was written and originally supposed to be interpreted.
So what they did is back then they issued a blanket rule basically treating threatened species as if they were endangered. And this says, no, that rule is not right. We're going to start doing this on a case-by-case basis.
Precisely, and another thing that there's been a lot about is the changes in critical habitat designation. As a general rule, critical habitat isn't all that much of additional protection for most species, because just listing gives them full protections. This just adds a little bit more protection on it, but it's extremely, extremely costly. And when you create critical habitat, there are two kinds of habitat that can be designated as critical by the feds. And one is habitat that is actually occupied by the listed species, by the endangered species, and another is habitat that's not occupied by the species. There's habitat there that the species might be able to use if the species were there or if it could get there, but it's not there, and they go ahead and give that the same protection, so nobody can use it as they do for a habitat that is actually occupied. And so that's an attempt, that change is an attempt to end that and say that it's occupied habitat that is the habitat that gets critical habitat designation, and the government wants protections for.
Let me interject for a second here, because the way you explained it is the way it's supposed to be understood, but it's even worse in actual practice than you've described, because in recent years they have been declaring areas critical habitat that not only don't contain the species, but in their current conditions couldn't provide habitat for the species, but rather the owners of that property would have to make positive changes to make it occupiable. So that's crazy.
That definition has become more outrageous with time. I mean, almost every aspect of the Endangered Species Act, what you see over and over and over is to be nice about it, call it mission creep. I mean, the bureaucrats are always trying to accumulate more power and more authority than themselves so they can regulate more of this and more of that, and essentially regulate everything, every piece of land in the country. I mean, that was the basic fault, or the basic flaw, which made the act, such a failure, and made most people in the country, most landowners, so afraid of it, is because instead of being geared to find the best way to help species recover and maintain healthy populations, it was essentially put in place to be a cost-free method of national land use control and federal zoning on all the land across the country. So they could regulate any piece of land from the smallest farmer, tell him that you can't go out and plow this area where you've been raising crops for 100 years and your father before you or something like that, or you can't go harvest these trees on your land that your grandfather planted 100 years ago, because now there's a woodpecker that's come to nest in them now that they've become 100 years old, thanks to all of your preservation of those trees and protection and stewardship of those trees over the years. And what we're going to do, we're going to shut you down. You can't use your land. And by the way, even though the Fifth Amendment says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, we're not only not going to give you just compensation, we won't give you any compensation. And this is how the act has been used. And I mean that was the intent. That was another thing. Those four guys who drafted the original law that Congress passed said what they wanted to do. They carefully went through to make sure they had eliminated all wiggle room within the act, so that once a species was listed, you had to shut down anything that would threaten it. That was their whole intent, and they never explained that carefully to Congress, and Congress either didn't care or was so carried away by the hysteria of everything supposedly going extinct, big spasms of extinction. And remember, everybody was writing that overpopulation, that everything was vanishing, there'd be mass starvation in the world within 20 years. All the fish were about to vanish from the seas, on and on and on. And people got bought up on that, and they passed this nonsense without having any thought of what was going to happen or what it was going to do. And now we're living with the consequences of that.
Looking to show off how much you care about freedom? Need a gift for someone? Head to the Heartland Institute's store at store.heartland.org for t-shirts, posters, and books, all advancing the freedoms you cherish. Grab a bumper sticker and show the world you believe in liberty. Find Heartland books such as Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, Power to the People, Nothing to Fear, and the Kid-Friendly Constitution. Grab a Heroes of Freedom t-shirt featuring Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and Martin Luther King Jr. Or get one of our always popular Don't Tread on Me shirts with Heartland's unique design. Those will be sure to start a conversation at your next barbecue or at the gym. Your destination for the freedom lovers in your life is the Heartland Store. Go to store.heartland.org and get shopping today.
So they also propose to, in some way, it's very vague to me, propose to make consistent listing and delisting decisions to end a lawsuit parade, because it's sometimes hard to get species on the endangered species list, but it's next to impossible to get species off the endangered species list. Even after they've recovered, they've met the goals set for them by Fish and Wildlife Service that environmentalists didn't challenge. They've exceeded their population goals, and still the environmentalists fight it. So they're trying to change that, and to look at something about they call foreseeable future. Could you discuss those a little bit?
Well, basically what's going on there is that they don't want to give up to let species really come off the list. There have been practically no species that have come off the endangered species list, over the 45 years that it's existed. Of some 16,000 or 1,600 listed species, only something
we also list foreign species, takes it well over 2,000.
Right. Only something like 40 or 50 have come off the list, and a majority of those, 11 of those were extinctions, which wasn't much of a success story, obviously. Some 37. When you examine carefully, came off the list because of what's called original data error, and the rush to try and shut something down, or shut down a project, or stop a water canal for some area in Arizona or something like that. Rush to list of species and say, well, we've only been able to count 2,400 of them, and everywhere that we've looked. And so it has to go on the Endangered Species Act, and they put it on the list. And then a few years later, somebody starts looking around and finds those things are everywhere. I mean, actually abundant.
Or they determined that they weren't really a separate species in the first place. They were part of.
Or they weren't a separate species, or so on. But basically, that's called original data error. They list something in a rush because they want to stop a project. They count all the wildflowers on this side of the hill and say we only found 37 wildflowers or something, like the 2005 400 tuber mock growberries. And then somebody goes up to the top of the hill and looks over the other side, and as far as you can see, there are more tuber mock growberries. Instead of being endangered with 2,400, they found it was relatively abundant, because they'd only surveyed 1% of all the available habitat for the species when it was listed, and then once it was listed, then people had a chance to make some money off it and so on, and get grants for their university because they were studying it and so on. And people go out and start looking everywhere, and more often than not, they find that these things are all over the place. That's happened over and over and over. And the other thing that's happened with all this is that they're spending so much of the money on expenditures on litigation. It has regularly been that up to 2/3 of the endangered species listing budget goes for litigation. For court orders and for settlement agreements and so on, and much over the whole issue of critical habitat designations, as to whether it should be or not, or whether it's occupied or unoccupied. And as I said, the critical habitat designations don't add that much more protection overall. And yet the Greens are screaming that some changes are being made, or they're screaming that budgets are being cut. Well, if they would stop suing all the time, there'd be enough money to help recover things.
RJ,
I mean, who really cares about these endangered species? It appears that the Greens don't care at all. All they want to do is get them on the list so they can stop projects, so they can prevent landowners from using their own land and pay them no compensation, and they don't really care to them what happens afterwards, and so they just stay on the list forever. Because as long as they're on the list, the government can come in and control things and regulate things and threaten you with a fine or a jail term or whatever.
So how will the Fish and Wildlife Service's actions change that? I
don't think they're really going to change that. I mean, they'll change They'll change some of these really controversial and really expensive things that certain people are going through as to whether the habitat on their land that's been designated critical habitat, as to whether that habitat is unoccupied or whether it really exists or whether there's anything there or what would have to be done, and it will stop trying to extend critical habitat for non-endangered species. But it's not going to do anything with the basic problem of the law. Is that the law penalizes landowners for being good stewards.
Well, wait. Before we get to that, so you don't even think it'll improve the delisting procedure?
Well, okay, it'll probably it will, if this gets carried out, if this comes into place or something, it will make the delisting procedure somewhat easier. But on the other hand, is you attempt to delist something, even when it's clearly exceeded the population numbers and the numbers of populations and so on, and the total number of individuals, when it's clearly exceeded that and so on, other Greens will come in and sue again if you attempt to delist it, and this just keeps happening over and over and over. And so I don't know what you do with the nonstop parade of lawsuits. Maybe this can do something. I hope so. But in all the attempts we've made in the past, we just keep seeing more and more lawsuits, and they keep everybody in the Department of Interior, and the Office of Endangered Species, and so on, all the field biologists and so on. They're all involved in testimony, preparing testimony for court, and so on. And they're not out in the field. They're not doing studies. They're not helping, maybe change habitat or whatever they have to do, or improve habitat. I'd like to be more optimistic about that. But in all the attempts we've made to improve the act over almost half a century now, all I've seen is that, things get worse. I mean, they're thrown in things for, huge landowners. If you own, millions of acres of land, you can, cut deals, habitat conservation plans with the feds and so on that allow you to use your land if you use it on a rotation, 100-year rotation or something like that. But by the time you cut some trees in one area and get back to that area 100 years later, it's regrown and there's habitat for the species constantly being there. But if you're a normal landowner, if you're a normal farmer or a rancher or a tree farmer or a home builder or a homeowner or something like that, you're screwed if your use of your land, if an endangered species or even a threatened species gets listed on your property, and that's the problem with the act.
I got to step in here. So once again, the assessment just seems to be, it's a hope and a prayer. It reduces some of the litigation, but it's not clear because it's not a fundamental reform. It's not clear it will solve the problem. It's still a full employment for attorneys act is what it is. So leaving aside the regulatory changes they proposed, if you were environmental czar, based on your research experience on private conservation, and could fundamentally reform the ESA, how it operates, what changes would you make, and why do you think it would improve species protection?
Well, the first thing I would do would be to replace the Endangered Species Act with a non-regulatory act. I mean, the only way Congress can make the Endangered Species Act work for both people and for species and stop making stewardship liability is to replace the existing compulsory regulatory act with a voluntary, non-regulatory, incentive-based act. So the government comes and works out arrangements with landowners. What can we do to protect this land? Because the way it is now, the way the reason it's been such a failure is because it's bad for people. The better a steward a landowner is, the more wildlife habitat he has on his land or is left on his land, whether it's hedgerows or fence rows or ponds or old dead trees that various animals can species can can live in or whatever, the more wildlife habitat he leaves on his land or creates on his land, the more likely he is that he'll be shut down. He'll be penalized for this and told he can't use his land. Well, Economics 101 tells us that if you penalize good behavior, people will stop doing it. I mean, why go out and do something and create habitat on your land or maintain habitat on your land that will get you shut down so you can't use your land and you won't get any compensation? I mean, what the land has done, and even major environmentalists, people like Michael Bean, who's considered Mr. ESA, and wrote the book on the history of American wildlife law. Even he pointed out that what landowners are doing on land all over the country, with the red-cockaded woodpecker as an example across all the pine forests of the southeastern United States, from Virginia to Texas, what it's doing is maintaining habitat on that land and being good stewards on that land a liability. They're punished for it. And he said it's not that they hate the environment or hate the red-cockaded woodpeckers, they're just trying to protect themselves. So that they harvest their trees sooner than they would have, sometimes decades sooner, or they clear-cut and turn the forest into pulp, send it to pulp mills and make toilet paper out of it, and so let it grow for 100 years before they harvest a magnificent tree, because endangered species will come in on their land.
In order not to attract the woodpecker.
Right, and so you begin to make your land unattractive to wildlife, and you begin to do things to sterilize your land. You get rid of the habitat that you fear might suddenly turn up, cause an endangered bird to show up in your land, or endangered butterfly, or an endangered snake, or whatever, or a turtle, or whatever. Because landowners don't hate wildlife. They're not afraid of wildlife on their land. What they're afraid of is the feds on their land. And the feds come in and shut them down. You have to get rid of that perverse incentive that drives landowners to be afraid to be good stewards of the land and have wildlife on their land. I mean, before the ESA passed, we have lots of examples. That's what I worked on when I was at the CEQ, the President's Council on Environmental Quality, showing examples of private stewardship and how it had worked over the years. And this is now this ethos in private landowners is vanishing, is being destroyed, driven out by the fact that the government now penalizes people instead of recognizing them and awarding them, or maybe finding a way to give them a subsidy somewhere or something. I mean, look, under the ag system, the CRP program on erodible farmland and so on, the Department of Agriculture has paid landowners to not farm that land and leave it in grassland for common birds like meadowlarks and red-winged blackbirds and song sparrows and stuff like that. Well, if we can pay landowners to protect habitat for common birds, why can't we find a system that will work for endangered species, which are far more important to protect? We haven't done that. Instead, we come in with a 2x4 and hit these guys across the head and take their property and make them fearful of wildlife. And it's been an absolute and total disaster. It's been probably one of the worst anti-habitat, anti-wildlife laws that's ever been passed. And that's all been covered up because the Greens always keep mentioning a few so-called recoveries that they claim were due to the Endangered Species Act, but really weren't. And so they've hoodwinked the public on this, and, as they're doing now with all their screaming again, trying to stop these procedural changes, a couple of which, as I said, would be quite important as to how they carry out day-to-day operations.
So, to sum up and then wrap up, you would replace the current system with an incentive-based system.
With a voluntary, non-regulatory, incentive-based system, you go ahead and list species. Decide it. Put species on the list on the basis of whether we know they're truly threatened or truly endangered. Let's get and much better science, because the science has been horrible. the scores and scores of species had been put on the list, and it turned out later that the science was rotten. They shouldn't be on the list. They were already extinct in many cases, or they were very abundant. People just counted in the wrong place or hadn't wanted to give the right numbers. They just wanted to stop projects. List things, and then once it's listed, then start working out voluntary relationships, voluntary contractual relationships with farmers to do various things. I mean, they might delay harvest for X number of years so they can produce enough, so the bird that's on the property can produce enough young, and then maybe transplant that bird to another area, as they could well be doing with red-cockaded woodpeckers all over the place. Put in a nest box for the red-cockaded woodpecker on some other property that was protected, like on government land or something. We recovered the wood duck, which was on the way to going extinct in the 1920s through private action, because all the bottomland forests were nested in holes in trees. Most ducks nest on the ground, so there's no problem. But if you nest in holes in trees and we cut down the forest, then the bird's in deep trouble. So what Friends of the Wood Ducks came up with was the idea of let's put up artificial nest boxes, like an artificial home. Nail them up on trees, nail them up on posts, nail them up in woodlands all over the country. And they had a huge success. From being on the verge of extinction in the 20s, it became the second most populous, commonest, abundant duck in the eastern flyway by the 1990s. And the feds were encouraging hunters to shoot more wood ducks and take the pressure off other ducks. It was such a huge success story. But look at the endangered
RJ, we got to cut it off here, buddy.
Okay.
We're way in. I hate to do it, but like I said,
that's okay. I tend to get carried away and get long-winded, and certainly don't make sound bites.
Once we get going, we could go forever. But I want to thank you. I'm pleased that I could finally have you as a guest on Heartland's podcast today, and I want to thank you on behalf of myself and our listeners.
Well, it was a delight to be on, and this is a very important issue, and thank goodness for Heartland for being interested in these key issues to both protect the free and prosperous society we have, and for protecting our natural and wildlife heritage. You're doing proud.
Well, listeners, thanks for checking in on us today. Please check Heartland's website as we follow the work of R.J. Smith and the Endangered Species Act and policy reforms. There's also some movements on the Hill to perhaps modify the Endangered Species Act. We'll see if anything happens. It's not the first time they've come up. If they pass, it'll be the first time they succeeded. And as we track the progress of energy and environmental laws and regulations that affect you, and go frequently to our PolicyBot site, your one-stop shop for free market solutions to public policy problems. In addition, if you're not already receiving these podcasts daily on your favorite device, go to iTunes and subscribe. And when you have the time, please rate our podcast on iTunes so you can help us expand the reach of free market ideas. Thanks. Take care. Bye.